The courtroom was alive with the kind of subdued chaos that marked every weekday in downtown Atlanta's Fulton County Courthouse. Lawyers shuffled papers, defendants whispered nervously, and the faint echo of gavel strikes bounced off the high ceilings. It was business as usual, or so it seemed. At the center of it all was Judge Michael Grant, a man whose career had been defined by his no-nonsense approach to the bench. Known for his sharp intellect and even sharper tongue, Michael was a rising star in Georgia's legal system. His courtroom wasn't a place for theatrics or excuses. It was a place for facts, fairness, and the rule of law. But today wasn't going to be just another day at work. As the afternoon docket began, Michael scanned the list of names with a practiced eye. It was a long roster of minor infractions, parking tickets, small claims disputes, and other low-stakes cases. One name caught his attention: Patricia Evans. There was nothing remarkable about it on the surface, yet it stirred something in him, a flicker of familiarity he couldn't quite place. The bailiff called Patricia's name, and the courtroom door creaked open. Patricia walked in with a quiet confidence. She wasn't loud or confrontational, but there was something about her presence that demanded attention. She wore her natural curls and a loose halo around her face, her dark eyes steady and unflinching. She wasn't dressed to impress, just a simple white blouse and black trousers, but she carried herself like someone who refused to be underestimated. Michael's gaze locked onto hers, and for a split second, the mask of impartiality he wore so well slipped. His expression tightened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of his bench. This wasn't just another defendant. He knew her, or, at least, he knew who she was. Michael tried to steady himself as Patricia stood before him. He cleared his throat, masking his unease with the crisp authority of his voice. Miss Evans, you've been cited for failing to pay a traffic ticket issued in March. Do you understand the charges? Yes, Your Honor, Patricia said, her voice calm but firm. Do you have an explanation for why the fine wasn't paid on time? Patricia hesitated, glancing briefly at the people in the gallery behind her. She knew this wasn't going to be a fairy tale moment. The truth was simple and painful. I lost my job a few months ago, Your Honor, she said finally. I had to choose between paying the ticket and keeping a roof over my head. I chose the roof. Michael's face remained unreadable, but something in her words seemed to hit him. He had heard similar stories before. Of course, poverty wasn't an excuse in the eyes of the law, but it was a reality that couldn't be ignored. Yet Patricia's explanation wasn't what truly unsettled him. What rattled him was her name. It wasn't the first time he'd heard it. Patricia Evans had been a part of his life, albeit indirectly. Many years ago, she had been best friends with Lydia Harper, the woman Michael had once been married to. Michael's marriage to Lydia had been a whirlwind romance that burned out as quickly as it ignited. Lydia was bold and vivacious, a free spirit who thrived on passion and spontaneity. Michael, on the other hand, was methodical and reserved, his world revolving around deadlines and decorum. Their differences, which had initially drawn them together, eventually became insurmountable. During their marriage, Lydia often spoke about Patricia. She was more than a friend, she was Lydia's rock, her confidant, the person she turned to when Michael's work consumed him or when their arguments became too much. Patricia had been there for Lydia in ways Michael hadn't. The divorce was messy, but it was also inevitable. Michael buried himself in his work, climbing the judicial ladder with single-minded determination. He hadn't seen or thought about Patricia since, until now. As Patricia handed over a stack of documents, evidence of her financial struggles, Michael felt a strange mix of emotions. Guilt? Regret? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that he couldn't treat this case like any other, not when their lives were so unexpectedly intertwined. The documents painted a stark picture: bank statements with balances hovering near zero, a termination letter from her previous employer, notices of overdue rent. This wasn't a woman trying to shirk responsibility. This was someone barely holding on. Michael leaned back in his chair, the weight of his position pressing down on him. His decisions carried real consequences, and he wasn't one to take that lightly. Based on the evidence provided, he said finally, I'm reducing the fine to $50. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Michael rarely showed leniency, especially not in cases as straightforward as this one, but he wasn't done. Miss Evans, he continued, his voice steady but tinged with something Patricia couldn't quite place. This reduction is not a precedent. Future violations will be handled with the full weight of the law. Patricia nodded. Understood, Your Honor. She turned to leave, but Michael's voice stopped her. Wait. The room fell silent. Patricia froze, her hand on the courtroom door. Do you still speak to Lydia? Michael asked. his tone measured but heavy with implication. Patricia turned slowly, meeting his gaze. There was no anger in her expression, only a quiet defiance. "No, Your Honor, not in a long time." Michael nodded, his face betraying nothing. "You're dismissed." As Patricia walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the encounter began to sink in. She hadn't expected to see Michael again, let alone under such circumstances, but now that she had, old memories started to surface, memories she had tried to bury. Meanwhile, Michael remained seated, staring at the door long after it closed behind her. For the first time in years, he found himself questioning the line between his personal history and his professional duty. Patricia Evans walked out of the courthouse, her mind a whirl of emotions she hadn't prepared for. She had been so focused on dealing with the logistics of her case, the paperwork, the stress, the shame of being in court, that she hadn't even considered the possibility of seeing someone from her past. And not just anyone. Michael Grant had been a shadow in her life once, a name that carried weight only because of what he had meant to her best friend, Lydia. To Patricia, he'd always been more of a symbol than a person, the man who had made Lydia both radiant with love and hollowed out with heartbreak. Now, he was something else entirely, a man who had just decided her fate. The afternoon sun was blinding as Patricia stepped outside. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder and made her way toward her car, parked several blocks away. Each step felt heavier than the last, her mind replaying the brief but loaded exchange with Michael. The question he'd asked, "Do you still speak to Lydia?" echoed in her head. It wasn't just the words, but the way he had asked them, with a kind of quiet intensity that made it clear he wasn't just making small talk. Patricia hadn't spoken to Lydia in years. Their friendship, once unbreakable, had fractured under the weight of Lydia's divorce. Patricia had tried to be there for her, but Lydia had grown distant, retreating into herself in a way that no amount of support could fix. Eventually, life had pulled them in different directions. But there were things Patricia remembered vividly. The nights Lydia cried in her arms, recounting Michael's coldness, his obsession with work, the way he seemed to love his career more than he loved her, the fiery arguments that left Lydia emotionally drained and questioning her worth, and the rare, fleeting moments of happiness that made the heartbreak all the more cruel. As Patricia unlocked her car and slid into the driver's seat, she couldn't help but wonder, what was Michael really like now? Had he changed? Or was he still the same man Lydia had once called both the love of her life and her greatest regret? Back in the courtroom, Judge Michael Grant sat at his bench, staring blankly at the stack of case files before him. The courtroom had emptied out for the day, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He couldn't shake the encounter with Patricia. When he first looked up and seen her standing there, it had felt like someone had punched the air out of his lungs. He hadn't seen Patricia in over a decade, but he had recognized her instantly. And with that recognition came a flood of memories he had tried to bury. Michael had always known, deep down, that he hadn't been the husband Lydia deserved. He'd loved her in his own way, but his love had always been conditional, contingent on her fitting into the meticulously planned life he had envisioned for himself. When she didn't, when she pushed back against his expectations, he pulled away instead of working through it. Patricia had been a constant presence during their marriage. Michael had resented her at the time, though he would never have admitted it. She was Lydia's lifeline, the person she turned to when Michael wasn't enough. And now, all these years later, she was standing in his courtroom, forcing him to confront the parts of himself he least wanted to examine. Michael sighed and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had always prided himself on his ability to separate his personal life from his professional responsibilities, but today, that line had blurred in ways he couldn't ignore. That evening, Patricia was sitting in her small, cluttered apartment, a mug of lukewarm tea in her hands. She had spent the past few hours trying to distract herself, cleaning, scrolling through social media, anything to keep her mind off the day's events, but nothing worked. When her phone buzzed, she picked it up without checking the caller ID. "Hello?" There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a voice she hadn't heard in years. "Patricia, it's Michael." Patricia froze, her grip tightening on the phone. Of all the things she had expected, this wasn't one of them. "How did you get my number?" she asked, her tone sharp. "I still had it," Michael admitted, "from a long time ago. I hope it's okay that I called." Patricia didn't respond immediately. She wasn't sure what to say. I couldn't leave things the way they were," Michael continued. "Seeing you today brought back a lot of memories, and I felt like I owed you an explanation. Or, at the very least, a conversation." Patricia exhaled slowly. "You don't owe me anything, Michael." "Maybe not," he said, but I owe it to myself to say this. Can we meet, just to talk? Patricia hesitated. The last thing she wanted was to reopen old wounds, but something in Michael's voice stopped her from saying no. Fine, she said finally, but don't expect me to sugarcoat anything. Michael chuckled softly. I wouldn't expect anything less. The next evening, they met at a quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of town. Patricia arrived first, choosing a table in the corner where they wouldn't be overheard. She wasn't sure what she expected from this conversation, but she knew she wasn't going to let Michael off easy. When he walked in, he looked different, less composed, more human. He wasn't wearing his usual suit and tie, just a simple button-down shirt and slacks. Thanks for meeting me, he said as he sat down. Patricia nodded but didn't respond. She wanted him to start. Michael took a deep breath. I've spent the past 24 hours thinking about what I wanted to say to you, and I guess it comes down to this. I wasn't a good husband to Lydia. I know that now, and I think, deep down, I knew it even back then, but I didn't want to face it. I told myself I was doing everything for us, for our future, but the truth is, I was doing it for me. I put my career above her, and I paid the price. Patricia listened, her expression unreadable. Why are you telling me this now? Because seeing you today reminded me of the kind of person Lydia needed me to be, and it reminded me of how much I failed her. Patricia leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. You're right, you did fail her. And you didn't just fail her, you failed yourself. Lydia loved you more than anything, but you let that love slip through your fingers because you were too focused on things that didn't matter. Michael flinched at her words but didn't argue. He knew she was right. Do you know where she is now? He asked. Patricia shook her head. Last I heard, she moved out west, California. Maybe, but we haven't spoken in years. Michael nodded, a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. I've thought about reaching out to her, but I'm not sure she'd want to hear from me. She might not, Patricia said bluntly, but if you really want to make amends, you need to be prepared for that. As their conversation wound down, Patricia found herself feeling something she hadn't expected, a sliver of empathy for Michael. He was still the man who had hurt Lydia, but he was also a man who was trying, however imperfectly, to confront his mistakes. Do you think she's happy now? Michael asked quietly. I hope so, Patricia said. She deserves to be. Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful. Thank you, Patricia, for meeting me, for being honest. I needed this. Patricia stood, gathering her things. Just don't expect me to be your therapist, Michael. If you want to fix what's broken, start with yourself. As she walked out of the coffee shop, Patricia felt a strange sense of closure. The past couldn't be changed, but maybe, just maybe, it could be understood. Michael Grant couldn't sleep that night. His conversation with Patricia had cracked something open inside him, a vulnerability he hadn't felt in years. He thought back to Lydia, her laughter, her fire, and the way she had looked at him in those early days as if he were the center of her world. How had he let that slip away? The answer was simple: neglect. Now, for the first time in years, Michael felt an undeniable urge to make things right, not just for Lydia, but for himself. But how? It wasn't as if he could just pick up the phone and call her. Patricia's vague mention of California gave him a starting point, but it was still a long shot. He had to try. The next morning, Michael sat in his office, staring at a blank notepad. He didn't know where to begin. Lydia had never been one to leave a clear trail. She valued her privacy too much for that, but Michael remembered one detail from their marriage that might help. Lydia had always dreamed of living near the ocean. She used to talk about moving to a small coastal town, opening a bookstore, and spending her days reading and listening to the waves. It had seemed like a silly fantasy at the time, one more thing Michael hadn't taken seriously. Now, it felt like a clue. Michael opened his laptop and began searching for small towns along the California coast. There were dozens of them, each more picturesque than the last. It was overwhelming, but he was determined to narrow it down. He remembered another detail. Lydia had once mentioned a town called Mendocino during one of their rare vacations. It was a place she had described as perfect, quiet, charming, and full of life. It was a long shot, but it was the best lead he had. After some research, Michael found a phone number for a bookstore in Mendocino. It was called The Turning Page, and its website featured photos of a quaint shop filled with mismatched furniture and shelves bursting with books. It looked exactly like the kind of place Lydia would run. Michael hesitated for a long moment before dialing the number. His heart pounded as the phone rang. Hello, this is The Turning Page. How can I help you? The voice on the other end was warm and friendly, but it wasn't Lydia's. Hi, Michael said. his voice shaking slightly. "I'm trying to find someone who might work there. Her name is Lydia Harper." There was a pause, and Michael held his breath. "She doesn't work here," the woman said finally, "but she does own the shop. Can I ask who's calling?" Michael felt a wave of relief and panic all at once. "This is an old friend," he said. "I just wanted to reconnect." "Well, you're in luck," the woman said. "Lydia's here right now. Hold on, I'll get her." Michael's grip tightened on the phone. He hadn't expected to get this far, and now that he had, he wasn't sure what to say. "Hello?" The voice was unmistakable. "Lydia," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a long silence on the other end. "Michael?" she said finally. "It's me," he said. I wasn't sure if you'd even want to talk to me." Lydia's laugh was soft but tinged with disbelief. "You're right, I'm not sure I do, but here we are." Michael took a deep breath. "I know this is out of the blue, and I don't want to intrude. I've been thinking about you, about us, and I realized there are things I need to say, things I should have said a long time ago." Lydia didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was guarded. "Michael, it's been years. Whatever you think you need to say, I'm not sure it matters anymore." "It matters to me," he said. "Please, can I see you? Just for a few minutes. If you don't want to hear from me after that, I'll respect your wishes." Lydia sighed. "I don't know if that's a good idea." "Please," Michael said, his voice breaking. "I need to make this right, or at least try." There was another long pause. "Fine," Lydia said finally, "but don't expect much. I'm not the person you remember, Michael, and I doubt you're the person I used to know." 2 days later, Michael found himself standing outside the turning page. The shop was even more charming in person, with flower boxes lining the windows and a small wooden sign swinging gently in the breeze. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The smell of books and coffee greeted him, along with the quiet hum of conversation. Michael scanned the room and saw her almost immediately. Lydia was sitting at a small table near the back, her auburn hair streaked with gray but no less striking. She looked up as the bell over the door chimed, and their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Michael walked toward her. "Hi," he said, his voice tentative. "Hi," Lydia replied, her expression unreadable. Michael sat down across from her, suddenly feeling like a nervous teenager. "You look good," he said awkwardly. "So do you," Lydia said, "though I'm guessing this isn't a social call." Michael smiled faintly. "No, it's not." They talked for hours, their conversation weaving between the past and the present. Michael apologized, truly, deeply apologized, for the ways he had failed her. He didn't make excuses or try to justify his actions. He simply owned up to his mistakes. Lydia listened, her expression softening as he spoke. She shared her own experiences, telling him about the struggles she had faced after their divorce and how she had finally found peace in Mendocino. "I don't hate you, Michael," she said finally. "I did for a long time, but I don't anymore. Life's too short for that." Michael felt a wave of relief but also a pang of sadness. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I just wanted you to know that I've changed. Or at least, I'm trying to." Lydia nodded. "That's all anyone can do." As the sun set over Mendocino, Michael and Lydia stood outside the shop, the air cool and salty. "Thank you," Michael said, his voice quiet, "for giving me the chance to say all this." Lydia smiled faintly. "Take care of yourself, Michael. And don't look back too much. The past is the past for a reason." Michael nodded, knowing she was right. As he walked away, he felt a strange sense of closure. He hadn't fixed everything, some wounds were too deep for that, but he had taken a step toward healing. And that, he realized, was enough. Michael Grant drove away from Mendocino with a heavy but unburdened heart. The hours he had spent with Lydia felt like both a reckoning and a release. He had sought forgiveness but found something more valuable, understanding. Yet as the miles stretched between him and the small coastal town, he couldn't help but wonder what would come next. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of revelations about himself, his choices, and the people he had taken for granted. But one person lingered in his thoughts more than he had anticipated, Patricia. Her unwavering honesty, her refusal to let him off the hook, had been a turning point. If Lydia had shown him what he had lost, Patricia had forced him to see why he had lost it. Back in the city, Michael reached out to Patricia. It had been days since their last conversation, and he felt a need to close that chapter, too. He wasn't entirely sure why, perhaps because Patricia had always been Lydia's anchor, or maybe because she now felt like his last connection to a life he had left behind. When Patricia agreed to meet him for coffee, Michael felt both relief and trepidation. "You're persistent, I'll give you that," Patricia said as she sat down across from him at the cafe. Michael offered a sheepish smile. "I owe you an update. And probably another apology." Patricia raised an eyebrow. "For what this time?" "For dragging you back into all this," Michael said. "I know you didn't ask for it." Patricia shrugged. "I didn't. But I'm here, aren't I?" Michael nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "I saw Lydia," he said finally. Patricia's eyes widened. "And? We talked. Really talked. I told her everything I needed to say, everything I should have said years ago. She didn't forgive me, not in so many words, but I think we found some peace." Patricia leaned back, crossing her arms. "So, what now? Are you expecting a happy ending?" "No," Michael said firmly. "This isn't about that. Lydia has her life, and I have mine. I just wanted her to know that I've changed, or at least, that I'm trying to." Patricia studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "You're serious about this, aren't you? About changing?" "I have to be," Michael said. "I can't keep running from my mistakes. And I can't undo the past, but I can try to be better moving forward." Patricia nodded slowly. "Well, good. It's about time." Over the next few weeks, Michael threw himself into his work with a renewed sense of purpose. Being a judge had always been more than just a job to him, it was a way to make a difference. But for the first time, he began to see his position as an opportunity for empathy as well as justice. He started listening more carefully, considering the lives behind the cases that came before him. He thought of Patricia and the struggles she had faced. He thought of Lydia and the resilience she had shown in building a new life for herself. One day, a young single mother stood before him, facing charges for shoplifting. Her story was painfully familiar: financial desperation, a system that seemed stacked against her, and a sense of hopelessness that had driven her to make a bad decision. In the past, Michael might have focused solely on the crime. But now, he saw the person. "I'm sentencing you to community service," he told her, his tone firm but compassionate. "But I'm also ordering you to attend financial counseling. There are resources out there to help you. Use them." The woman looked up at him, surprise and gratitude flickering in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Michael nodded, feeling a sense of satisfaction he hadn't felt in years. One evening, as Michael was going through his mail, he came across an envelope with no return address. The handwriting on the front was unmistakably Lydia's. He hesitated before opening it, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Michael, I've been thinking about our conversation. It wasn't easy for me to see you again, but I'm glad we talked. For what it's worth, I believe you when you say you're trying to change. And I hope you keep trying, not for me, but for yourself. Take care of yourself. Lydia." Michael read the letter twice, a strange mix of emotions washing over him. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely. But it was something close to it. Michael decided to call Patricia one last time. "What now?" Patricia said when she answered, her tone half joking. "I got a letter from Lydia," Michael said. "She said she's glad we talked." Patricia was silent for a moment. "That's more than I thought you'd get," she said finally. "Me too," Michael admitted. I wanted to thank you, Patricia. For everything. For not letting me off easy, for making me face things I didn't want to face." Patricia laughed softly. "Don't get all sentimental on me now, Michael. You've still got a lot of work to do." "I know," Michael said. "But I'm ready for it." As Michael hung up the phone, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, change never was. But for the first time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. The past would always be a part of him, but it didn't have to define him. And with that realization, Michael Grant finally began to let go. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more compelling stories just like this one.